like people to raise questions or points or just anything about anything really that you would like to share, this is your moment. And we have a panel of wonderful guests here, now some of whom you have already met today, others you have not yet met. So we will introduce them, unless there's anything I've forgotten to say.
I think you just want me to do a couple of notices.
Oh yes, I beg your pardon. Yes, go on, Sheila, a couple of things first.
Just a reminder, please check your mobile phones that you've turned them off or on silent. Thank you very much. And I think the main thing really is just to say that we do sell DVDs of the presentations, and so the open forum will be filmed, and so if you ask a question, you may see yourself on your telly, and you can order them after the, during the weekend. That's all I think I need to say, really.
Jolly good.
Else, yeah.
All right, okay.
Yeah.
So, the idea is that somebody raises a point or a question, and then our panel will dish out enlightenment, or something like it anyway. So let me introduce you. I'll start at this end. So the gentleman here is Mr. Richard Smith. Now, he's known to many of you. He's been a speaker here before. He was a key member of the Centre for Crop Circle Studies some years ago, when we still had such a thing. He is an expert in lenses and eyes, and maybe we'll hear more about that later on. So a round of applause for Richard Smith, please. Now, Jazz, who we see sitting here, most of you will have seen Jazz this morning. Big on consciousness, resonance engines, and the inner Google, which I love. So a big round of applause for Jazz Rasil. Thank you. Now, this lady in the middle here is going to be speaking to you tomorrow, Patrina Holsworth. She has a long and rich history, was once a barrister, was once chairman of UKIP, so maybe we'll hear more about that later on. And will be giving us tomorrow a vision of how government could be. So, but just for now, a big round of applause for Patrina. Okay, so the gentleman here, you're going to have to wait a little bit of time for this man. Nigel will be closing our Sunday afternoon, and Nigel is a man of great, shall we say, talents. Now, we saw Nigel about 2 years ago, and was talking of his time with the Maharishis some years back. But in more recent times, the big thing has been working on the Bosnian Pyramid. Now, if you've not heard about the Bosnian Pyramid, you are going to hear about this when Nigel speaks on Sunday afternoon. Been out there, part of the excavation team who believe there is an underground pyramid, and we're going to find out much more about that. But just for now, a big hand, please, for Nigel Grace. And following a tradition, actually, we began only last year when Piers, the marvellous recorder player, came and joined us for the forum. We thought, this man, John Dalton, now he is an excellent speaker as well as an excellent player. So we thought it was time to hear a little bit more from John because he's got so much to give. So some opportunities here. So another big hand for Mr. John Dalton. So, let us begin. So, does anybody down there want to begin the proceedings, a question or a point? And if you don't, we're all going to be ended very, very quickly here. Right, we have a gentleman there, Sheila.
Hi, question for the panel. I'm one of these people that's sensitive to Wi-Fi energy, especially these smart meters and these smoke alarms that are being forced on people that rent accommodation. I'll be interested in hearing your views on this.
Well, I'd like to say that I sympathise with you, and I think that the occasional stories we read in the newspaper about people who are so affected by Wi-Fi that they have to live perhaps as far remote as possible and also have special shields on their windows and around their beds. This is the tip of the iceberg, and I think a lot of people are affected. But, we're a very adaptable creature, and many people get used to the effect and carry on using Wi-Fi. But I think it is fundamentally harmful. I myself use a mobile phone, but I always have a yard of cable between me and the phone. And I think hands-free telephones at home are the same. And the increasing use of Wi-Fi is, I'm sure, going to have a lot of ill effects on humanity.
I think one of the... is this working? Yeah, it is. Okay. One of the major problems we have with this entire electromagnetic spectrum situation is that none of us are being told the truth. For example, if you look at terrestrially trunked radio, TETRA as it's known, we have never been told that the blue lamp services, it started with the police, and this system is different from mobile phones, but it does pulse at just below the beta brainwave levels. And we're never told. And the problem is actually trying to get to the real truth of exactly what's going on out there. We eventually became a nation of guinea pigs with 3,300 tetramasts out there, which are permanently pulsing. And if you happen to live where they bounce, then hello, leukemia, I'm your man. And this is not fair. And this is another breakdown of the whole democratic process. So I sympathise with you. I'm married to someone who can turn the TV on. Actually, no, we don't have one anymore. Flicking like switches without actually touching them and so on and so forth. So if you are electromagnetically sensitive, a lot of what's going on out there is not good. And I understand about 2% of the population are seriously affected by this. Again, trying to find the true numbers is a Chinese art. So I sympathise with you, and anything you can do to actually bring this to attention is worthwhile.
Hello, great question. Maybe what I could do is just go back to the basics a little bit and perhaps explain the difference between clean electricity and dirty electricity. Because this leads into your question, I believe, that does anyone know that the difference between the clean and the dirty electricity?
That was dirty, Nigel.
That was dirty electricity. Why does that happen? The clean electricity are the filaments in a light bulb. For example, it has a very low power, but it lights up the room. That is direct, it's clean energy. But what is happening more today is that electricity, the 220 or 115 volts are being stepped down to what we use on a cell phone or a light bulb. No, sorry, not a light bulb. That would be at the higher level. And there are these devices that are scaling down the electricity to these other devices that we use, such as a cordless phone in the house, such as a mobile phone. And it's these even a dimmer in our living room. It's these little devices, tiny little devices, that are introducing scrambled or dirty electricity. And it's this electricity that we are so sensitive, it's bad for our health. The interesting statistic is that 70% of the electricity generated is now dirty electricity from these little devices. So one thing that we can certainly do is to make sure that the devices we have in our home are not these little things that produce dirty electricity. The second thing that I find very useful is that our little meters, where we have to read the numbers, that's all right at the moment. The smart meters are certainly coming in. It's a very high profile being pushed in by the government, particularly our MP from East Sussex. Very high on the priority. Often the electricity is not properly in phase. So that means that the electricity could be missed. You could be paying for a lot more than you're using. And there's a little device that you can actually get from Germany that puts the electricity into phase. Or in alignment, so that, first of all, you're cutting out this out-of-phase problem. So those two things can actually... Now, unfortunately, these little things you can plug in from Germany, they're quite expensive. And I could, by the end of tomorrow, actually give you the name of one that you can buy. So if you take care of those two things, that's a lot. And thirdly, I read an article from someone who was able to mask the harmful effects of a smart meter with foil around the device itself. We're lucky in this country that some of us still have manual read meters. In America, that's not the case. And in new homes, it's not the case. So we can just learn about little things like that can improve the electricity in our homes. Thanks.
Well, having my first degree in... Is this coming on? No, it's not. Yes, okay. My first degree was in physics, and I studied radioactivity and certainly studied semiconductor electronics and how they're used to put together microchips. And one of the things I learned from my second degree, my master's degree, where we did simulations of molecular biology, simulations of drugs prior to them going out to clinical trials, was, in my case, I was looking at drugs specifically which work on the brain. Anti-epileptics, anticonvulsants, and what's also known as neurasthenics, drugs which relax muscles prior to surgery. So they're like local anesthetics. And all of these drugs, what they do is they work on, if you think about what anesthetic does, it basically makes you lose consciousness, either at a global level or a local level, in a certain part of the body. So what it means is that the anesthetic acts on a part of the body that must be responsible physically for consciousness. And it turns out there are two structures in every cell that seem to have their electrical currents shut down as a consequence of anesthetics. In cells, there are the scaffolding, if you like, of the cell, the nervous system of the cell itself, is made up of tubes of protein called microtubules. Inside these tubes of protein is water. And the water acts like a gramophone needle. It picks up disturbances from the electrical field around the person and within the person. It picks up disturbances of energy from the quantum vacuum. And then those disturbances are translated into electrical currents, which then are translated into chemistry in the actual cell. So if you think about how a gramophone needle actually works, it picks up bumps on a vinyl record, and those oscillations are turned into sounds in a speaker. So it's exactly the same process, except the water molecules are converting electrical disturbances into chemistry inside the cell. So water plays a really critical role in how the body responds to electrical fields and how it interprets them into chemistry in the actual body itself. Now, there's another structure in every single cell that you'll find. It has its own DNA. It's technically not human. It's something that came into human eukaryotic cells about 3 billion years ago, and it symbiotically merged with them because at the time our cells couldn't process oxygen. So our cells entered into a symbiotic relationship with these creatures, these bacteria, and they're currently labeled in cellular biology as mitochondria. Okay, mitochondria have their own DNA. They're not the same as the DNA you find in the nucleus of our cells. They only come down the female line, okay, of your family. They are normally attached to the sperm, but when the head enters into the egg, the tail, which contains the mitochondria and provides the energy for it to flap around, is detached. So the mitochondria, the things that actually provide us with energy, they're considered to be the power stations of our cells. All right? Your energy requirements for your body are all met from creatures that are not human and that have been passed down the female line. And that's not conspiracy theory, that's just standard biology. Okay? And ask anybody who's a molecular biologist or cellular biologist, and that's what they'll tell you. And I find that incredibly fascinating. But there's a unique thing about mitochondria is that on the inside, where all the chemical reactions take place for providing and generating energy for the cell, there's folds of tissue, and known as cristae. And these cristae are liquid crystal in nature. Now, anybody who's ever understands the basics of electronics and things like radios will understand that a lot of the technologies rely on crystals. Okay, you might have heard of a crystal radio set, for example. Semiconductors are effectively crystals. And a lot of modern technology uses crystals which actually are so sensitive that they translate signals from quantum levels upwards. They actually quantum devices. So you see a lot of quantum devices in modern electronics. And one of the ones that's most famous is something known as a Josephson junction. And it's the person who created it, he was awarded the Nobel Prize because this little device actually teleports electrons from one part of an electronic circuit in a electric circuit to another part. And the fact that he was the first person to produce a working demonstration of a device that teleported electrons, he won a Nobel Prize for that. But that junction is found in a lot of electronic devices. It's a quantum device, and it actually generates dirty signals of the kind that you're mentioning. Now, you'll find there's probably hundreds of these kinds of devices, if not thousands, in any typical electronic device that's been created probably after about 1990, I imagine. So Wi-Fi, which requires for signals to be sent into the quantum field and then be picked up by something else, is going to generate the kind of electrical field which has been described as dirty. Now, it's dirty because it actually interferes with the water molecules in your body and their ability to pick up signatures of electrical energy, magnetic energy, which some people think are actually linked to consciousness. So the microtubules, the water they have inside them, they're really pickup devices for consciousness from the quantum field. That's really what they're there for, as well as the mitochondria. So if you muck around with the water, or you make the water in some kind of way corrupted, then the microtubules can't pick up, if you like, the physical representations of consciousness and translate them into chemistry in the body. So if you want to get around that, there are certainly ways you can do it by directly working on the electrical fields, as has just been mentioned, by working with devices that kind of cancel out the effects. But in the long run, what you really have to do is work on the water in your body. Okay, your water is being destroyed by these things, and therefore it has to be replaced in a way which allows your microtubules to effectively pick up consciousness, but also, and this is what I find really interesting, your microtubules don't just pick up signals associated with consciousness. Some of you may have heard of Roger Penrose, a famous physicist from Oxford. He wrote a book called The Emperor's New Mind. He worked with an anesthesiologist in America. They were both wondering why is it that people lose consciousness with anesthesia, and if we could find where the anesthetics act, then whatever those things are must be responsible for the gateways of consciousness. And they found these microtubules to be these kind of gateways. This is where the anesthetics act. They stop the electrical currents running up and down them. They basically switch off the electrical currents of your nervous system inside of your cells. And what he found was this. He found something for me that's absolutely remarkable. And this relates to the whole thing to do with Wi-Fi and all sorts of other new emissions that have been around for the last 100 years or so. The field of space and time that you're in, by it alternating and waving around up and down, it creates gravitational ripples. It creates waves of gravity. And at lower dimensions, the ones that we live in, those waves of gravity appear as electricity and magnetism. Okay? So he basically said that gravity, when it acts on the brain, it gives rise to our consciousness and our thoughts and feelings. And it's these microtubules that pick up the signals and turn them into consciousness. But it's a two-way street. It turns out that your consciousness, your thoughts and feelings, through those microtubules, can actually send out signals. And you can transmit consciousness into the field around you and even influence people around you. So, as I was talking about earlier today, an experiment that I was looking to do was see if this can be done in a coordinated where people's consciousness could be joined up. But unfortunately, there is a problem, which is a lot of Wi-Fi signals and microwave signals associated with mobile phones and with transmitters, they are causing any transmissions that are going out from an individual that might be positive through meditations and things like that, it's causing for them to be corrupted and for people not being able to create resonance in terms of their shared vibration. And I should know, for 4 years, I actually worked for a mobile phone company. All right, I was their IT manager. And then I went to work for BT. And when you work with telephone exchange engineers and you work with mobile phone engineers, you get to understand about microwaves, especially, if not other low-frequency radiation, which can affect the body. A lot of the body's internal communications happen through low-frequency communications, ELFs, as they're otherwise known as, so extremely low frequency. And I know from a physics background that microwave radiation and variations of that come from routers and Wi-Fi's and masts, they do one thing. You may have heard reports when that there's maybe rain, for example, that your signal might be lower than it normally is, or that if communications are happening through microwave from point to point, if there's a cloud in the way or humidity's high, then those signals tend to get degraded for some reason. And the reason is because the water is absorbing the microwaves, and so some of the signals getting lost. So sometimes we have to tell our customers, when I was working in these companies, has it been raining where you live? And they say, yeah, it has. Has it been high in humidity? And right, okay, that's why. The water is actually absorbing all these microwaves. And of course, our bodies are made mostly of water. So you can expect for you to soak up like a sponge everything that's going on around you. As I said, the number one solution to that is to make sure that the water you're taking in actually replaces the corrupted water inside your microtubules. And you might need to get water that's been energized through a vortex process. That tends to be the best. There's lots of devices that use vortex-based spinning principles in order to ionize and energize the water. If you use those kinds of devices, or you get water that's come from a natural spring and through a vortex motion, or through some of the devices that Rudolf Steiner actually used, where water was cascaded down through vortexes, all of those things energize the water in such a way that it acts as a perfect pickup device for consciousness as opposed to anything else. So my suggestion is that if you're having issues, go and get these either energized water from natural sources that work through vortices, or get some of these devices which energize the water by pushing them through a vortex or a spiral kind of structure.
Maybe it'd be better also, perhaps it might be a good idea to invest in an old Bakelite telephone and a pre-war radio, and if possible, a pre-war television.
Or just talk to people directly, face to face. Get off the devices, all right?
I think you won't be at all surprised to hear I've got nothing I can usefully add.
That'll do. All right, no, fantastic questions and fantastic answers. Right, next one.
Briefly, I've been told. Mention of Rudolf Steiner, very interesting. You might be interested to know that there's work being done by an anthroposophical pharmacist. She's a doctorate in pharmaceuticals, working with peat that comes from Scotland and Ireland as a very good shield and mask for the electronic things that are going on. That's still in its early stage, but it's underway. Secondly, I used to run a shop here on the high street when we were doing the anti-Wi-Fi thing. One of your engineers came in and he said, "What's all this worry about Wi-Fi?" And he says, "I'm a telephone engineer." He says, "Wi-Fi doesn't worry me," but he says, "I will not let my family and children have mobile phones." And then he told me about it. Then the next day he came in and presented me with 2 written sheets with his name signed at the bottom, saying that, the danger of mobile phones are really, really bad. So, and it might be help if I forwarded these sheets and you can circulate them, because he put his name to it. Thank you.
Could I just add to that? Also, I'm sure most people here know that it is very unhelpful to your body to use microwaves. It's not just what comes out of the microwave and might get to you that way. It changes the whole molecular structure of the food, and it can make your blood precancerous fairly rapidly. I know when you go out, you don't know how they're cooking things, do you, to restaurants, but certainly at home I'd never use one.
Yeah, I should add that there's some experiments that have been done recently which just microwaved water, to a sample of water, and split it into 2. And one sample was microwaved, and the other one was just normal mineral water. It was left as it was. And both samples were used to water to watercress samples. And after a while, you could see that the microwaved water that had been fed to the watercress had led to that watercress being about 1/3 to half the height of the watercress are being just fed with the normal mineral water. So you've got to understand one thing about microwaves, as I said. They work principally by vibrating the water molecules in the food or in your body. And if you try and stick anything dry in a microwave, you usually recommended to put a glass of water in with it, so that steam can come up and it can lead to the dry bit of food actually being, heated up. Microwaves rely on water molecules being around and being vibrated, and that vibration between the water molecules causes friction, and that creates heat, and that's how the food's actually cooked. But unfortunately, that vibration also breaks up the proteins and nutrients and other contextual compounds that bring life to the food. So it's unfortunate that you get a meal, you get fodder, basically, that feeds you, but it doesn't nurture you. It just doesn't nurture you. And about a week or so ago, I made a choice that from next week, I'm not going to have any more food which is packaged in any kind of way. That means it doesn't come in a packet, it's not even wrapped by the supermarket if it's a bit of fruit or something like that. If it doesn't come in its natural skin, I'm not going to be touching it. And that includes liquids as well. So Coke, anything like that, which wine is different, I guess, because it's been processed as
I think on that note, maybe we should move on.
Anything that's kind of natural.
Yeah. All right. Okay, let's have a new question. Do we have any other questions? Oh, no. Well, thank you and good night. Oh, yeah, no, gentleman there.
Thank you. Further to the concept of clean and dirty electricity, could the panel discuss the work of Nikola Tesla and in relation to that, and indeed if his ideas are being used by people that we don't know about at the moment?
Does everyone know the name Nikola Tesla, or does he need an introduction? Okay. I think it was about 1870s to 1950 that Nikola Tesla lived. And he was a great scientist. I think one of the greatest scientists of the last 200 years. And there's a story about how he was walking through the forest one day and he saw a great lightning storm. And he had this vision that if electricity could be produced in a very pure form, in sufficient quality, then that we could essentially transform the conditions of life on this planet. We could green the deserts, we can create oceans in the desert. And so his life mission was to produce wireless energy that is benign and can be distributed throughout the world. He began, for example, to build a tower. And this tower, I think it was called Wycliffe Tower. And what he did is he created a pyramid at the top of the tower, but had a round part, the pyramid having infinite sides, which means that it was smooth all the way around with an orb on top. And what he actually did is he did a number of experiments, one of which was to transmit the electricity and lightning up into the ionosphere. And the ionosphere is this thin layer around the planet that keeps our planet with the life inside the planet. And it was then projected down with greater power, and he was actually able to create or light 25,000 homes in that area. But tragically, his grant ran out because I think it was the Rothschilds was
J.P. Morgan.
J.P. Morgan, thank you, was sponsoring his work until the point he realized that you can't charge, or you can't ask people to pay for free energy. And so his grants ran out, and Wycliffe Tower was actually burnt down and destroyed. Had our planet benefited from Tesla energy instead of the energy that's produced today, which loses 40 to 60% of its power as it's generated across the cables, I wonder what sort of world we'd have today. Any comments?
Yeah, there's a cartoon which shows a couple of aliens looking down on Earth with all the power stations gulping out smoke and stuff. And they're talking to each other and saying, "We sent them Tesla and they did what?" And you do find actually that technology that Tesla produced, he's not the first to produce that technology. If you look historically at the pyramids and other architectures around the world, they seem to have designs which are very similar to Tesla's, and that they actually use underground aquifers to generate static electricity, which is then made to flow, channeled up through a pyramid-type device, and through some kind of gold connector, like a capstone that they have at the top of the pyramids, to send the energy into the ionosphere. And it was thought that that's what really the pyramids were for. They provided power for a vast region around them, and the underlying aquifers were used to generate and store electricity. The sarcophagus that was supposed to be at the center of the Great Pyramid, where there was supposed to be a mummy, supposedly. It happens to be the perfect proportions for the Ark of the Covenant, which is thought to be a giant capacitor. And the reason why the pharaohs ran after Moses, who kind of nicked it, was because he was nicking their power supply, basically. And it's funny how the Egyptian empire kind of crumbled after that, when this power that they had was taken away from them. So I've read a lot about Tesla, and many of you may not know, but Tesla is actually responsible for creating electricity as we currently use it, in the AC form as opposed to the DC form. The transformers that you have for your devices, which turn the mains electricity into the electricity that your hi-fi needs or something like that, they were designed by Tesla. They're designed to take electricity from a higher power source and deliver it back into a lower power device. And there's a lot of other devices, including quantum-based technologies, that were created by him. And unfortunately, J.P. Morgan, as has been said, he's the kind of person who wanted to make money and was not willing to give away something where he couldn't make a buck out of it. So he pulled the money for Tesla and told him he would get back to him and let him know whether he would get a grant or not to continue his work. And to the day that he died, Tesla was saying, "I'm still waiting to hear from him," believing he really trusted in J.P. Morgan being able to do that. With regards to the question, what technologies are currently being used right now, there are technologies which, as I said, are quantum-based, and they're actually used in missile guidance systems. If you look at any of the technologies that in modern drones that are used in warfare or in modern missile guidance systems, you will find that there are technologies known as transcapacitors. Many of you might be familiar with the idea of a capacitor or a resistor in electricity and electronics, and they store electricity, basically. A transistor is actually short for transfer resistor. It's a device that's based on resistance. But he created a device which was based not on resistance, but by capacitance. And it turns out that some people suggest that this technology was actually found in the technology that was salvaged from the Roswell craft that crashed in the 1940s. So he had created it, and then they discovered that the same technology existed in this extraterrestrial craft. And some people actually went on to develop technology. And you might find an interesting coincidence about this, which is it was around this time that the inventors of the transistor miraculously created the transistor. And it's only because part of the technology, which is based on resistors, was passed on out of the defense realms into the public arena. The other technology, which was based on capacitors, which is about 1,000 times faster than transistors, and in terms of storage capacities for hard drives, was about 10,000 times more bigger. That was kept in the military, and it started to be used in modern guidance systems when they need to scan the territory of a landscape as they were going over it to identify a target. It's used in radar, and identification technologies. In the short term, some of that got transferred over to the communications technologies, mobile phone companies, and there is some technology which was kind of a hybrid between biological and electronic that was found in those particular technologies, and I believe that's currently being used by Monsanto. So there are people who've got hold of it, and they are already using it.
I think Nikola Tesla probably will go down in history as one of the most important scientists of the 20th century. There's no question. I wondered how long it would be before we mentioned the word banker. Follow the money as usual, but they're, by all accounts, and Jazz has mentioned the extraterrestrial influence and so on and so forth. By all accounts, if any cursory examination of some of the more intelligent contributors to YouTube, there's an awful lot out there on free energy which can be traced straight back to his door. Now, how much the military-industrial complex, how much use they have made of this, by a lot of accounts, there's an awful lot going on in North America, particularly with the Skunk Works programs and so on and so forth, which we're simply not aware, and where the millions and billions of tax dollars are siphoned off. It's all off balance sheet, it's all off accountability. And, of course, I think it was Eisenhower in his valedictory said, beware the military-industrial complex, because this technology, without question, has been hijacked for nefarious purposes on stupid wars and things like that. It remains disgusting that 1 billion people are hungry in this world and another 1 billion are obese. What the hell is going on? This is nuts. So whichever way you break this down, if you look at the Disclosure Project from Stephen Greer, for example, whatever you think of that, he's absolutely adamant. He really wants to expose the whole free energy technologies, and there are plenty of people like him. And you can lay this right back at Tesla's door. The guy was bright. He happened to bump into Morgan, who said, "Stuff you, buddy, I can't sell this." And that's what it boils down to, follow the money. And it's a great tragedy because mankind has been negatively affected. Too many people are living on the wrong side, and it's simply, no one said life was fair, but this is disgusting. And this guy is pivotal, he's important, and there's no other way you can write him. He is actually one of the brilliant contributors of mankind.
I also think that the internet is actually down to him, because if you watch the biography of Tesla, where Orson Welles actually played J.P. Morgan, it's a dramatisation of his life. In it, J.P. Morgan specifically says that what he wanted Tesla to do was create a technology where images and photos could be wirelessly transmitted and shared to the public. And he went away to actually develop the processes to do that. And then after the Second World War, that got adopted by the Defence Research Projects Association, DARPA. And if any of you know the history of the internet, that's where the original infrastructure for the internet was created, and then it got extended out into the public when Tim Berners-Lee created the World Wide Web.
I haven't really got anything to say particularly about Tesla, because I have never read a book about the man. But the question that seems to be begging to be asked here is whether electricity is in any way good for us. I mean, it's incredibly useful, but I wonder whether it has any beneficial effects for humanity at all. I have a perhaps unfashionable belief that the forces that are at work within electricity stem from beings, that all these forces within the earth stem from subnatural beings, that when we release them into our environment, they don't have a good effect. And whether it's Wi-Fi or living under power lines or being fed images which are coming from some centre and which we cannot verify, the benefits are very dubious.
Could I just say briefly that I agree that I think he was a most marvellous chap, and I understand that he died in poverty and his patents were bought up very cheaply. I understand they all ended up with the American government, who are now using them for their own purposes. But as we've also heard, that a lot of people now, through YouTube and the like, have seen what he could do. And in fact, even I, who know not a lot about these things, are rung up by various people I know who are experimenting and actually managing to get electricity to flow and starting to put it into their own houses. I don't think I'd like to be their wives, because the whole thing could go up in flames. But, you know, people are actively engaged in trying his ideas out, which is good, because you cannot keep a good idea down.
Okay, let's have a new question. We've got a bunch of very interesting people. We have a lady here. Sheila, do you want to just bear with us? The mic is coming your way.
I'm not used to talking on a microphone. I don't know if it's working, is it? Talk into it. Oh, and what about crop circles? What creates a crop circle? Is that positive energy? I've understood that the crops actually grow better afterwards.
Well, I've heard various accounts of whether the crops grow better afterwards. I've certainly seen at conventions I've attended evidence to the contrary, that they are in some ways distorted and burned by a powerful force which has caused the crop to bend over. So the panel may have other views on that. As to what creates them, the crop circle phenomenon is rather, in my mind, analogous to an art movement, which starts with the works of art, rather primitive, but with a great deal of energy. And it has reached a high point with this marriage of technique and form and energy. And I suspect now that it's declining somewhat. In other words, it's a phase of birth and death that we're experiencing through an art movement. These things are artistic, but I feel that the message they fundamentally contain is this: we think that the natural world is something that we can manipulate and tamper with just for our own benefit, and that clearly, in my opinion, there are beings that work within the realm of nature who are showing us a message that there are other beings working in these crops, especially these monoculture crops that we have artificially created. And we need to learn to respect nature a bit more, perhaps.
There is, I think, no question that the definitive answer as to what causes or what creates crop circles, the answer is we simply don't know. My first experience of crop circles 25 years ago, a friend of mine flew a microlight over a circle in Goodworth, Clatford, near Andover, and his microlight engine conked out and he crashed. And it happened to somebody else over the same formation. So this got our attention. What the hell is going on? We don't know what caused them. The advances in visual technology, now there is quite a lot of film of crop circles being created which seem to have passed the laboratory analysis that say they're genuine. In my opinion, this is a form of, all you can put this down to is a form of communication, and that takes in the man-made stuff and it takes in the stuff that obviously is not man-made, because some of this has happened extremely quickly and it's happened in the middle of the night. It's extremely difficult to make 500 crop circles that are actually perfect in 10 minutes, whatever the number is. So they are a form of communication, but for me, and I think for an awful lot of other people, they actually have been the key to the door to meeting a lot of interested people, and it's like a reversed funnel. The water comes down and then it spreads out all over the place, and it's brought in so many other subjects, animal mutilations, UFOs, 101 things, and the same tribe of interested people keep on coming together, and this symposium is a classic example. People keep coming back, and it has given us the key to many, many different things. But as to what causes them, nobody can give you an honest answer. It's not possible. Yet.
I think, obviously, I'd agree with that, but I think there's quite a bit of evidence, isn't there, that you have the bouncing light syndrome around them. And there's a lot on YouTube, again, with that, and I know one or two people who've actually taken photographs of these lights themselves. And it is interesting that also, in the main, these crop circles tend to appear where there's chalk underneath, so that presumably there's something there to do with water as well, being held in the chalk. If you look at the map where they appear, it's nearly all chalk. And on the bouncing light syndrome, I was lucky enough to go and hear somebody talk a couple of months ago down in Suffolk. And he was an extraordinary chap, something of a medium. And he was taking photographs with his camera, and a friend of mine took some. And as I was talking to him, we had all these lights picked up on the camera. And I thought, well, it must be dust. And then I got the chap to take some more photographs when I was showing somebody how to dowse, and there were the lights again. But it hasn't happened since, and it only happened when he was in the room. So, I mean, there are some weird and wonderful things that possibly Mr. Tesla would be able to explain, but I certainly can't.
Well, having at one point even been asked to join the Centre for Crop Circle Studies scientific group, quite some time ago, having spent some time in crop circles and with a few researchers, I noticed certain features about the crop circles which led me to be aware of what might have actually generated them in terms of the forces, if you will. And I think, for me, I'm keeping myself open to the possibility that it's one or more of four things. Yes, it could be extraterrestrial craft or even Earth-based craft which happen to be used gravitational propulsion technology. That gravitational force is what allows the plants to be bent over and actually affect plant hormones inside the plants in the same way that plants would be affected if you turn them on their side and they change their direction of growth. The plant hormones fall in exactly the same places. So there seems to be an implication that gravity is somehow being manipulated around the plants to make them grow in particular directions or even be laid down. I proved this at one point. I thought if this is really true, then plants, the way that they grow is the stems grow vertically upwards against gravity and the roots grow vertically downwards, with the direction of gravity. And I thought, well, if these crop circles have genuinely been laid down by some kind of gravitational force, we should see that. We should see that on the surface, the stems will be going in one direction and underneath the ground, the roots should be going in the opposite direction. And if you could see a cross-section of the ground, you would see a kind of S-shape kind of configuration for something like that. Whereas something that had just been trampled on the surface, the roots wouldn't have been affected and they'd be just going straight down. So you'd have an L-shaped configuration. And I spoke to one of the researchers about this, and I said, who'd collected some stem samples, and I said, have you seen any samples where it's an S-shape? And he said he had. And that's an incredibly unusual thing to fake. You can't rearrange the roots under the ground without obviously disturbing the soil. So the fact that he found some of those things, for me, was enough evidence that gravitational force seems to be used. And that could be caused by a craft of some kind, certainly. It could even be caused by consciousness. I mentioned earlier there's a link between consciousness and gravity. And some people have said, they thought about things and those patterns have appeared out in the fields. But my overarching belief is this. I remember when I was a kid, I used to play with invisible ink. I was taught how to write things in invisible ink and secret messages. And I used lemon juice. And I'd write in lemon juice, and then you can use a lighter to heat up the dried up lemon juice, and it would carbonize it, and it would appear all black, and the message would appear. So it responded to heat, and the message would appear. And I began to think, is the Earth in some way got these patterns encoded, engraved into the Earth? And there is climate change going on. And it could be a physical climate change, or it could be a shift in consciousness kind of climate change. But that climate change is leading to these previously hidden patterns that were engraved in the Earth maybe many thousands of years ago, and they're just popping up as feedback saying that the Earth has reached a certain level in terms of its development, whether it's a physical climate change, as I said, or whether it's a shift in consciousness. So my belief is that I can hold some energy for the other beliefs and explanations, but my underlying belief, based on everything that I have, is that these patterns were engraved thousands and thousands of years ago, and they're signs for somebody or something that we've reached a certain stage in our development on this Earth, not just human beings, but all consciousness on Earth.
And not a banker in sight.
Could I just come in and answer something, that was asked specifically, which is this, that yes, there are changes to the plants. There's lots of work. There's work of William Levengood and Elcho Hasselhoff, who have shown distinct biological anomalies occurring. This involves change to the node length. The embryonic seed heads seem to be altered and mutated. Now, if you take circle-affected grain and you grow further generations of crop on from it, it can go one of two ways. Yes, you're right. Sometimes it can grow better. Other times it grows worse. And where you've had a crop circle, you will often find a year later, where there's a new crop on top, you will see a ghost image of that formation appearing. Now, it seems to happen for one of two reasons. Either the crop grows taller at that point, and therefore, as you suggest, better, or it doesn't grow so well, and you've got like a hole in the field in the shape of the previous formation. So, yes, there's no question. There's a lot of work out there which shows there are changes occurring to the plants, but it's not always for the better. It can go one of two ways.
A quick question. If the crop circle crops were harvested by Kellogg's and put into a special cornflakes, how many people here would buy that? And how many people would avoid it?
Although, as it happens, you probably have been eating crop circle grain all these years.
I quite agree.
Okay, Sheila, there's a gentleman over there.
Hi, I'd just like to hear any comments on the Montauk project to do with gravitational, electromagnetism, gravitational force, etc. I know a lot of, is it Belik's work has been rubbished. I just wondered if you knew, could shed any light on it. Thanks.
This is the chair thing, right? The Montauk project?
I'm thinking, the Philadelphia experiment film when the Navy tried to cloak, prevent radar seeing the Navy ship, and it ended up being teleported and they did succeed with the making it invisible.
Well, I'm pretty familiar with that. The Philadelphia experiment was the experiment done in the Second World War, and it was an attempt to make a ship radar invisible. It used gravitational technology to bend light around the ship. Unfortunately, in the process of them activating the cloaking device, they created a gravitational opening in space and time through which the ship teleported and disappeared from its naval dock and reappeared in another naval dock. Okay, so when it reappeared in the other naval dock, unfortunately, the ship kind of more or less came over intact, but the human beings, some of them had came over intact, some of them had fused. Their molecules had mixed with the metal molecules of the hull of the ship. Some faded in and out of invisibility, and what was interesting is it required a human touch to almost bring the consciousness, which actually holds the architecture of the body back together, to draw it back in to that space so that the molecules could gather back into a full body again. Others spent a lot of their time in psychiatric institutions. Some people walked through walls, never came through the other side. That was the original Philadelphia experiment. So they managed to figure out how to transfer matter, but they didn't, unfortunately, figure out how to transfer mind. And anybody who's here earlier when I talked about the 1% and the 99%, they managed to transfer the 1%, but they didn't know how to transfer the other 99% of the energy architecture that makes us up as human beings, which some people would consider to be consciousness. That's the reason why a lot of people fading in and out of visibility, because the consciousness container had been broken up. And that's.
What did they actually use as a force to do that?
They used gravity, but they used a very specific technique where electricity was used to create shifts in gravity. It's what's called electrogravitational technology. Einstein was believed to be one of the people that was working on that, and it was also partly based on technology that originally came from Tesla. The consequence was that this opening was created in the 1940s, but it didn't have just another opening in space, another naval dock in the same time. It also created an opening in the future. And it created this opening in a region which a military experiment was then created around, which is the Montauk scenario. And that seems to have plenty of points where it's created openings in time. It's a bit like when you throw a stone across a lake or a pond and it skips and it creates specific impacts. That's kind of what happened. When the Philadelphia experiment was carried out, it created this little openings in time, in the lake of time, or the ocean of time. And Montauk was one of those places where another opening was created. And there's probably some located in the future as well, which no doubt will turn up too. My personal belief is, having looked at it from probably from the 1990s when I first came across it. I understood that the only reason why it didn't work was because they didn't have technology to transfer consciousness. They only had technology to transfer matter. I have found since then that they have recognized in certain alien technologies that they've managed to get hold of that the extraterrestrials would sit in meditation in their vehicles. They would combine their consciousness with the field of gravity, and the two of them would work together to create an opening in space and time. And only people who had completely managed to center their consciousness and master it, almost, I wouldn't say in an enlightened state, but certainly in a state where they could transfer their consciousness along with the body of the ship, they were the only people allowed to control these ships. And I think the US government, as well as some other governments, are currently looking into using pilots who are specifically trained in consciousness techniques so that their body can be transferred along with the body of the ship.
It sounds as though when it happened, if it happened, it was a typical sort of military cock-up. And it was probably a good thing for all of us that it did go wrong, because the intentions behind it were not for the benefit of humanity, were they? And they probably still aren't, from what you're saying about the special training of personnel.
I have found out something which is amusing and gives me some kind of assurance, which is in some of the trials that were done to recruit the right kind of pilots, there's an 80% dropout rate because the people who were trained up to that level of consciousness end up not wanting to take part in it.
Okay, another question. Gentleman here.
This question is for Petrina. It's three questions in one, really, but it's on the same theme. Is representative democracy an illusion? Corporates, bankers, bureaucrats, the Bilderberg Group, the military-industrial complex, are they really pulling the strings? And finally, should we be worried?
I think I can answer the last bit pretty rapidly, yes. I think what the question you're putting is a good one, because there's so many vested interests at the moment that are pulling the strings. And when you vote for the Lib Lad con, as one would say, you really aren't getting political parties in there doing what they say they're going to do, because they're not bound by law to do so, as you know. Anything they say to you, if you give them the vote, they can do what they want. But they are really kowtowing to vested interests all the way around the world. The multinational groups, the JP Morgans, the Rothschilds, etc., they see them, as you know, behind closed doors at Bilderberg, at Davos and various other places. And I think now that Bilderberg's been exposed to the general public and anti-globalists have got there and been upset by the whole thing, they'll just simply change its name, close down Bilderberg, change its name and meet again. And I fully accept that if you're going to run a country and liaise with other countries about trade and whatever, of course you've got to talk to the big boys. You can't leave them out of the scene. But what we're finding at the moment now is we are getting to be, as Mandelson said, in a post-democratic era, because that's what our politicians appear to want. And the question is why. I think the answer is because it's a darn sight easier. If they find that they don't need to be elected, if they're just here and pushed forward by cronyism, it's so much easier, which is exactly what's happening in the European Union, that our commissioners, as you know, none of the commissioners are elected, but they have immense powers. And of course they like that. And if we end up having to pay them to be politicians, i.e. we have to pay for the parties to exist, we have public funding as opposed to us actually paying into a party that we like, which is, I think, what Miliband's after, then I think a great deal of democracy will be lost, because you won't have the ability for smaller parties to come up and infiltrate them, as it were, and take over some of the political know-how and votes in this country, because the whole thing will simply ossify. So briefly, yes, we should be worried. I think vested interests and other groups are taking over, And as we say, we do have this 1% that owns 40% of the wealth and 1% of the multinationals that own 40% of the multinationals. And that's a hellishly big proportion. And I think they're just buying their way in.
Is freedom or democratic freedom an illusion? Well, patently it is. Now, when you think that the first Reform Act of 1832, it took 96 years until 1928 for universal suffrage. Everyone over the age of 21, male or female, got the vote at this point. The whole thing appears now to be completely diluted. What are the reasons for that? I think we are being exhorted now to press red buttons, vote for this, vote for that. More people will vote for something on the X Factor than will bother to turn out for a general election. So this sort of thing really is not particularly healthy or helpful for the future of the democratic system. So where does the power reside? Of course, with the multinationals, of course, with a very few governing families, the Bilderberg people, and so on and so forth. And as has been rightly suggested, this will just be renamed and it'll emerge under the guise of something else. So we should be extremely concerned at the loss of personal freedoms, the supervision systems. We have more CCTV cameras in this country than any other country on the planet. We do surrender an awful lot of everything we do to credit card transactions and so on and so forth. But this country has one major advantage. If you wish to walk down the street without an ID card and a credit card, you are perfectly at liberty to do that. An awful lot of places, other places, you're not allowed to do that. So we don't have to carry ID cards and things like that. So the answer is to people who say, well, it doesn't matter because if you have a credit card, they know where you are. Or if you've got a mobile phone, they know where you are. That's quite true. But it's our choice, and it remains our choice not to carry that tackle if we don't want to. And I suggest that we really do need to take our democratic rights rather more seriously than we seem to be doing. Because, quite honestly, do we care? It's a real problem, and the youngsters really feel totally disenfranchised. They're not part of all this because they don't see any relevance in it. They don't see that their vote matters. Well, if you don't vote, then you better like what you didn't wish for, because it just arrives on your doorstep. So voting at a general election, frankly, you should do it, because don't complain at what you get.
I spend a lot of time in the House of Commons and also in the House of Parliament. I belong to a group called GlobalNet 21. So you can find out about that from their website, globalnet21.org. And they've been running meetings now for probably about 5 or 10 years. We've got about 10,000 members, a lot of them based in London. And a lot of what we focus on is open debate around and have forums on topical subjects, especially political ones or matters to do with social factors and well-being, amongst other things. I would say we probably hold at least 1 or 2 meetings in the Portcullis House, which is where the MPs will hang out in terms of their offices and things, as well as in the House of Parliament every month or two. And a lot of MPs actually sponsor and venue other venues that are actually given to us, providing they can come along and speak something about what they're doing themselves. And one of the big topics that we do discuss about is democracy. Especially we look at authenticity of MPs and transparency and a whole bunch of other things about them being accountable. And in one of the recent meetings that we had it in the Grand Committee room, which is one of the bigger meeting rooms for having discussions in the House of Parliament. And I'm the learning coordinator, by the way, for the organisation. So my job is to help members to learn from each other as well as beyond the organisation itself. And the subject of democracy is a big thing. I kind of hinted it in my talk earlier today, that on the whole, my sense is that people's will is not free. Their will is chained, not just in terms of things that are going on in their own lives, but it's chained down by a whole bunch of laws, that things that go right back almost to the American Constitution and times beyond that. Many of you might not know the American Constitution. One of the people that was contributing to that was a guy called Thomas Paine. And he wrote a book on common sense. Now, for me, it's fascinating that I was looking for books on common sense in government. I looked in in Amazon, and I only found one book, actual book on common sense itself, the subject, as opposed to the common sense of knitting or the common sense of dog rearing. And what he actually said was, left to their own devices, people use common sense to judge how they should be with each other. But at the point where they cannot use common sense, government needs to step in and provide that common sense on their behalf. But that's their job primarily, is to provide the common sense that the ordinary people are unable to provide between themselves and for themselves. And I think that's a really important part of democracy. Unfortunately, if you haven't got common sense, because people's will isn't free or they're not awake, then you are going to get government to do everything for you and make proxy decisions and surrogate decisions on your behalf, saying, we know what's good for you. Unless you wake up and you say, actually, I know what's good for me, and you're meant to be in service to me. I'll just finish on this one point, because some time ago somebody was asking me about the New World Order. And I don't know whether some of you are aware, but Monsanto just recently bought out the Blackwater Company, which is the biggest mercenary outfit there is in the world. And it makes you wonder, why is a GMO-based organisation buying up the biggest private army there is in the world? It wants to protect its little inventions and do all sorts of things. I don't know. But I also know that Bill Gates, part of the Bilderberg Group, he just got $25 million worth of shares in Monsanto. And I'm very well aware, just by looking at the business pages and looking at other things, you don't have to go into conspiracy theory. These things are in your face. And this is what people do. They hide it in plain sight. They hide it in plain sight. And if you're smart enough and you're awake enough, you'll get it. And there are ways for you to avoid being manipulated by them. Now, if a lot of people do it, then something interesting happens, which is this. When somebody asked me about a New World Order, I actually said back to people, we are the New World Order. We are the people who put these people into power. And if we wake up enough, we can actually take them out of power, and we can put people in place who represent us and empower us, rather than people who are focused on power and getting rich. We have people who are empowered and enriched. That's what's possible. So we are the New World Order. And when you can wake up to that, these worries about conspiracy theories to do with the New World Order, whether they're reptiles or whether they're politicians, it won't matter, because you'll be the one who is empowered. You'll be the one who's enriched. And if you can do it together with others, it will never, ever get removed from you, that liberty, that opportunity for you to exercise your free will.
I think it's worth remembering that we can't ever expect a sort of paradise on earth, because we operate via contraries that are in opposition, that create energy through these polarities. And so if we study history, we can see how decisions made in the past cast a long shadow into the present and have helped to create this civilization, this business-orientated civilization that we now have. And it's clear, James Madison, one of the founding fathers of America, said, the people who own the country should run it. And that is why the democracy we do have is a sham, clearly. And the end result in the business model is a race of masters and slaves. And this is what we're heading for. But the mission behind such a bleak picture is, of course, to wake people up, as you rightly say. So it's going to serve the purpose of waking people up, but it's not going to be very pleasant. And I think the signs everywhere, through the changes in the law, the diminution of personal freedoms, is going to have to get a lot worse before it gets better. But each one of us is free spiritually.
Nigel, I'd be very interested in your view. You've been very quiet here. I'm sure you've got lots of interesting things to say about this, having worked in the corporate world over there. You know how the way things run. What's your view? Is there a way out of this?
Well, my view is that we no longer have a functional democracy, either in Great Britain or in the United States. Perhaps I'll take a little time to substantiate that. Yes, you all agree. We are no longer in a functional democracy. End of story.
That's good enough. Okay, another question. Yeah, Sheila, behind you.
Thank you, Jazz, for reminding us that we are the New World Order. And actually, at this particular conference, in response to the concerns of dirty electricity, We have a young man in the shopping hall outside where the stores are selling orgonite devices, which you can put on your electronic devices, which will counteract the dirty energy. And it's out sale there. You can get 5 for £10. And I've bought 5, and I buy things every year. Also, he is creating for people on demand, when he has the money, chemtrail busters based on Tesla technology. They cost him £150. He's got boxes in various friendly pubs around Glastonbury where people put money and donations in when he's building one of these things, and he builds them to order when a community want them. So, good old Glastonbury and the Symposium, people are here. So thank you, Jazz, for reminding us, and thank you, Sheila, for letting me say what I wanted to say. Also, what happened to the Glastonbury coach tour yesterday, when it comes to orbs and crop circles and lights, a lady entered the crop formation dragged by her dogs. She was dog walking on the ridgeway and saw the formation. And she came with her 2 children and her 2 dogs. The dogs dragged her up to me, and they leapt on me. So we obviously started chatting. And she said, how are they made? And I talked a little bit about orbs, and her little boy's eyes are huge. And she said, that's interesting. I live just over there in that house that you can see. And, a few days ago, we saw all these lights and orbs dancing on the hill. Would that have, anything to do with the crop formation? So I said, what date was that? And she told me the date, and I looked up. And I said, yes, actually, that's when this appeared. And she had been alerted by a butcher farmer neighbour who'd turned up and said, come on out, look what's happening up there on the hill. And she'd been out every evening looking for the lights to come again. So when I said, when she realised that was the case, that the formation we were in was probably made by the lights that she had witnessed, she was really, really excited and phoned this butcher, who was very shocked and not very happy, because obviously his reality is just about to change, and he sort of senses that. So it was absolutely wonderful for our coach tour participants to actually encounter a lady who turns out to be a farmer's wife who's got land, and she said, I'd love to have a formation on my land. How can we get one? Could we get one? And I said, yeah, if you really want one. How? And I said, ask. Keep asking, and I'm sure you'll get one. So what you're talking about up there is actually happening. So thanks. And thanks, Sheila.
Thanks.
Go New World Order.
Andy, do we have time for a little story?
Yes, I think we do.
It's a story about what's happening now, tonight, 7 o'clock tomorrow morning, 7 o'clock the next morning, in a little village called Balcombe in East Sussex, close to where I live. For many months, the residents of this little village have been campaigning against an organisation called Quadrilla, I believe is the name, who are implementing fracking, the fracturing of the Earth's crust in order to bring pressurised water underneath and thereby releasing some sort of energy that could be used in oil. I'm not really going to comment on how efficient it is or how disastrous it is. I'd rather like to tell the story of what's been happening. After 900 personal letters and thousands of votes against this on the internet, on Facebook, on the government, on the Department of the Environment, our Department of the Environment has quickly, with very few people, allowed Quadrilla to drill. They made a very clear point that they had full confidence in the drilling company, Quadrilla, to take good care of the wastewater, even though it is poisonous, toxic, and also to give them license for nuclear active toxic materials. We've all been a bit worried about this. because we understand there are going to be hundreds, if not thousands, of very big lorries charging down our little country lanes, spilling toxic and radioactive waste. As the permission was granted by the Department of the Environment, we all got together on Facebook in all the villages around Balcombe, including my own, which is Forest Row in East Sussex, and we decided to go down there and have a tea party, rather similar to the tea party in Boston, but perhaps under different circumstances. So, 2 days ago, the trucks arrived, hundreds of trucks, down these little lanes with drilling equipment. And they did not get through. They were turned around by the residents of this little village, by hundreds of us, just turning up at 7 o'clock in the morning with our flasks of tea, our guitars and so on, and having a sing-song. And when they arrived, just said, no, you will not come here. Please go away. They came back the next day. This was yesterday. Again, everyone turned out, had a lovely time, and turned these trucks away. This morning, the trucks came again with the drilling equipment, accompanied by Her Majesty's police force, who are, I believe, in this case, representing the corporations, possibly a little bit more than the public. The police came and removed some of the ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, drinking their tea and orange juice, trying to stop the trucks come in, but even they weren't successful. So the third day running, the drilling equipment has not come through to Balcombe. Tomorrow they will try again, and all of my friends and the villagers of Balcombe will be there again. So please send us and the inhabitants and the citizens of the little village of Balcombe and all of the villages around East Sussex, that they may stop for a full week the trucks, the police, and the drilling equipment to come through. So please send your good wishes, because this is democracy in action. Thank you.
Okay, another question. Lady there. Oh, yes. Sheila, I'll get to you. Hold on.
Hi. How can you protect yourself against scalar waves, which are being used more and more by our covert operations, financed by the taxpayers for attacking citizens in the process of dehumanization of them?
Sorry, can you just repeat that? We didn't quite hear what you meant when you said scalar waves.
How can you protect yourself from scalar waves? S-C-A-L-A-R.
Oh, scalar waves.
Are those on the low frequency?
Yeah, they are effectively the waves of information that the body normally responds to in terms of its physiological functions, but it's possible that they can also be created by other devices. And it's a bit like the whole Wi-Fi thing, where there can be electrical and magnetic waves floating around, but behind these are other kinds of waves that actually disturb the natural functioning of the body and also the underlying functioning of our awareness and our consciousness. So I think Roger Taylor is someone who's done a lot of work in scalar waves and scalar wave technology to measure things like auras and measure disturbances to auras. So now I understand what you mean, scalar waves. What specifically was your question about that?
Well, they render you unconscious, and they're being used against systems. Say it again? I was saying they render a person unconscious. And they're being used against citizens by my lab, military intelligence working with aliens, who actually function with small black unmarked helicopters in the hours of the nighttime sleeping period.
Well, I've seen people do it even without aliens. I've seen military actually target these particular beams at individuals, and they can disorient a person initially, but this is probably one of the most sinister things there is. Because what I've been talking about earlier, about your will, put it this way, these devices are will destroyers. That's what they do. So you can imagine it being used in a battlefield. You send a few of these waves out to the enemy, and their will gets undermined. They just don't feel like fighting. There's something about what they enter into where mentally there's something which makes them go into a state of apathy. And as a consequence, they are just not motivated or driven to go forwards as they would be under normal situations. So I think there's a lot of harmful weapons in the world, but probably one of the most dangerous is the kind that can affect our free will. And for me, forget about the atomic bomb, when human beings' free will is able to be destroyed en masse, that's far more tragic and dangerous.
I think
Sorry. I was just going to ask her a quick question, actually. You're of the opinion, are you, that they're actually using them in this country against civilians?
They've been used in my property against me.
Against you?
Yeah. And because the police and everybody else is engaged in this, it's top secret operations. I'm not the only person in the UK.
So why are they pinpointing you, do you think?
Well, it's what you call targeting, isn't it?
Yeah, but why?
I wouldn't know the answer to that.
Oh. Well, my flabber is ghasted.
Okay.
Quite frankly. I mean, if such things are being used here, I'm absolutely astonished. I mean, if you genuinely think you are being targeted, then you'll laugh, but why not go to your MP? Why not go to the police or do something anyway?
I asked my MP, Zach Goldsmith, to raise the question in the House of Commons at Speaker's Question Time. He reported me to the Mental Health Department of Richmond. He is protected by the Illuminati.
I think that it's worth putting this point, that we human beings, we're under assault from all sides. You mentioned the will which is affected. I mean, television affects people's will and people's intelligence. Many people are a lot more stupid today, thanks to TV, than they might have been had they read good novels. And the technology, the radiations from electricity in various forms are also bad for us. There is one solution, I think, and that is not buying amulets or specially charged pieces of copper to go around the wrist or anything like that. We have to do spiritual exercises. We have to work on ourselves in a rigorous, disciplined way, and this will give us the forces and also the insight to know how to deal consciously with the forces, the people, the intentions around us.
I agree to that. I think one thing is very important. This is technology. This is technology you're talking about that has been created for a specific purpose. And quite obviously, it's very destructive technology. So the question is, can we create another technology that fights that technology? Even that technology could be questionable. So I wonder whether the best technology we can use or resort to is that of our mother, the planet, our Mother Earth, planet Earth, because she cares for us, her children. And her technology is in line with the cosmos. And one little thing that I often do is to walk outside every day without shoes, on the grass, in the countryside, in the forest, if you do have access to a forest or a wood. And I believe that this activity, without shoes, just in your bare feet, in the early morning when the dew is still on the grass, greatly strengthens the aura and greatly strengthens the natural electromagnetic field around us, which supports our health, immunity, and resistance to disease. And so I'm sure that isn't an answer that you were looking for in terms of another technology that can combat the technology that's being aimed in your direction. But I would humbly suggest to resort to the love of our Mother Earth.
I think this raises extremely interesting, as Nigel said. You invent one technology to do one thing. What do? Do you invent another technology to deal with that technology? This is crazy. This is cake making. This is nuts. This raises a number of ethical questions. When Stephen Hawking said philosophy is dead, he never said the worst thing possible, because philosophy is not dead. We have an enormous ethical dilemma now as to all the technology we develop. We simply are not keeping pace. We develop something and then we think, oh, what are we going to do with this? And there is evidence to say that Einstein actually regretted his involvement with the whole nuclear program. So we invent these things, and if you listen to, if you give any credence to the super soldier program and the CIA mind control programs and so on and so forth, what you're describing in some respects could be a tail end of this sort of activity. That is nothing short of disgraceful, because you're absolutely powerless to do very much about it. So this does raise enormous philosophical questions, and it also raises the question that a lot of the modern philosophers now are saying we have to redefine what we mean by the truth. And when you start questioning an analysis and the definition of a priori and post-a priori truth, and you're down to inferred scrutability, basically, I'm told something by X, and what do? Do I believe it? The answer now is extremely tough. You look at the news, do I believe it? You listen to conspiracy theorists, do I believe that? Because all of the conspiracy theorists will say to you, they'll make the following statement. They say, don't take my word for it, go and check it for yourself. Yeah, right. You do it all the time, and I'm going to go away and do all that on top of everything else I do. So now we are absolutely faced with interpretation of all the facts that we get. So not only is our democratic system falling down around our ears, but we have a massive philosophical problem, and ethics, of course, is one of the philosophical disciplines. And we are not keeping pace with our technological developments, and this is a major problem, because who's going to appoint the ethics committee? That's the problem. Who's going to decide whether a technology is good and what application it's going to be put to? It's out of control, and we have to get it back. And we get it back through education and genuine free trade and taking care of the stupid imbalances that exist. And it's not hard to fix. The money is there, the will is not. And it has to change. So what you're actually describing is a tail end of an extremely nasty piece of human activity. Yet again, evidence that sometimes mankind just goes nuts. Well, this is the off the balance sheet operations of the military industrial complex. We know this, yeah.
We can't hear you, I'm sorry.
It's all orchestrated by covert operations. And again, it's in farms where I live, which is where the covert, it's protected by the covert operations, because the students have it all keep it up.
Okay. Believe it or not, we need to close. I'd like to end on a positive note, though. So as usual, as is traditional here, I'd like to hear from each panellist, one by one, for not too long, please. What's the way forward? Positive thinking to end. Where are we going?
I think the way forward is spiritual exercises, and that involves going out into nature, as Nigel says. It involves appreciating the arts. It involves self-analysis and many other things which you can find in various spiritual streams. Because I feel that technology does drag us down, but the antidote is for us to work to develop ourselves to at least the corresponding degree above, and then we can gain insight into how to work with technology in a healthy way. So I feel the future is very bright indeed.
Well, Andy, that's a very difficult question, I would say. Thank you for asking. I've been extremely humbled today to listen to the speakers, particularly the talk on the active, the opposition to military action. That was so humbling to listen to that today. I believe it is very important to be aware and to be awake to everything that's going on in the world as much as possible, but somehow the task for us is not to become tainted, poisoned, depressed, or to give up hope while we become aware or we maintain our awakened state to all of the great suffering in the world. And whatever is happening, that what we call the government, I don't believe there is a government, but... So there's the thing, to be empathetic, but not to damage our own inner sense of peace and tranquility inside us. So how can we do that? I believe that if we're able to develop compassion, if we move from empathy to compassion, then perhaps we can see all of the troubles in the world, the frightening dangers that we see in the world, while at the same time seeing the growth of consciousness and the growth of love and the growth of compassion. The way that I would like to end is to echo back the one thing that I heard in the talk. Was it with Ben? Yes. And he said, of all the millions of people who had access to that information, it just took one person. Yes. Now, isn't that amazing? That there are so many of us, it just takes one of us to say something. And I remember there was this great little advertisement. Who's the gentleman who talked about the other guy? What's his name? About the disclosure, the whistle. Edward Snowden. There's this great little cartoon, and it had a picture of Obama. And you know the Obama thing is if you see something, say something. And then there's a picture of Snowden, and there was one word, did.
Well, I think actually St. Ignatius, as we were talking about Jesuits earlier, or refer to them, said something very apt. He said, don't worry too much, just do your very, very best. Whatever job you're given, do it with all your heart and all your mind, and then leave the outcome to God. And I think that was an extremely useful piece of information, and he carried on doing that himself because he had a wondrous belief in the grace of God. And I think even if you don't believe, I think it's sound advice in any event, because if we do all get together and do our bit for our families, communities, government, whatever it is that you do, whatever job you do, and then you can just, I'm afraid, you have to sit back and say, well, let us hope that works, because we live in a large community and we all have very different views on what we should be doing. And it may be right and proper that the outcome isn't what we want. And I think, in a way, if one can get Allah kifik, as the Arabs say, and say it is the will of Allah, then that is a very useful concept to have at the back of one's mind, because really one mustn't worry too much. One must simply do one's best on every different level that you can.
I remember reading some time ago some Sufi literature, which was about consciousness, and it triggered in me a conversation I had with somebody else who's a healer, and they were saying that when they work on themselves or work on their patients, they put a protective bubble around them. And I said, yeah, that's something I was taught to do too. And I relayed this to another healer who's a martial artist, and he said, Jazz, you work with quantum physics, don't you? And I go, yeah. And isn't part of quantum physics that your consciousness creates your own reality? And I go, yeah. So why would you create a reality where you need protection against things? Why would you do that? Why would you create people to kill you and take advantage of you and all these other kind of things? And I thought, that's an interesting point. So maybe I should be focusing on creating a reality with my intent where such things, there's no need for them. And the only way that can happen is if I myself, I'm engaging with everybody around me in a state of compassion. And it led me to be reminded of a movie some of you really ought to go and see, even if it's just for this one scene, There's a movie called The International with Clive Owen, and he's actually a CIA agent, I think, and he's found that these bankers are being very naughty and underhand, under the radar way, are selling arms to various nefarious states. And he manages to kidnap the chairman of the bank that's doing this. And he dragged him down to this basement, and he basically says to him, I'm going to expose you. I'm going to tell the world about what you're doing. And the banker rather smartly says, well, before you can tell people the ultimate truth, you have to tell them the truth that they want to hear. I heard it, but then I extended it a little, and I thought, oh, hang on a minute. Even if you tell people the truth that they want to hear, that might not change the truth that they actually believe. And even if you told them the truth that they want to believe, that's not going to necessarily change the truth that they're prepared to act on. And even if you change the truth that they're prepared to act on, that's not necessarily going to change the truth that relates to who they're being as a human being, ultimately, deep down, authentically. And you'd have to go all this distance, you have to go leapfrogging over all these truths before you even get to tell the person the ultimate truth. So I personally would say this, look, don't try and preach to anybody else. Look at the truth that you're prepared to hear yourself. Look, getting beyond that and getting to work on the truth that relates to your beliefs. Get beyond that. Connect to the truth that you're prepared to act on. Get beyond that. Get to the truth that changes who you are being from the caterpillar that just consumes, and put yourself into a state of a chrysalis and come out a butterfly where you're not consuming anymore, but you're respecting things around you. A caterpillar eats the home that it rests on. Okay? A butterfly, on the other hand, it's in a state of symbiosis with flowers. In exchange for nectar, it takes pollen. It's a completely different consciousness and mentality. So my message to each of you is hurry up being a caterpillar already. And get into that chrysalis and, transform yourselves into butterflies. Because then you'll be in a state of symbiosis with everything around you. It's just your journey. This whole thing that everybody's talking about earlier about crop circles, about being about you, ultimately it begins with you, your particular pixel in the hologram. Change that, and it will naturally cascade to every other pixel. Every other little tiny bit of consciousness is out there will change. But you've got to be the first one to do it completely. I'm on that trip, and I'm hoping that everybody else, from what I know of you, is certainly making inroads into that trip. What I ask you to do is stay committed. Stay committed. Don't lose your will. Okay? Keep freeing it. And one day you will be completely free and be able to spread that freedom to others.
I think all of us were quite impressed with Ben's talk on the military and so on. And I asked him outside, I said, a matter of interest, Ben, they sent you to Iraq, they sent you to Afghanistan. Did they tell you why? And he said, no, I don't think they ever did. Which kind of sums that up. As far as the grand question is concerned, I think that the future is extremely encouraging, strangely enough, despite all the current negativity that may be flying around. Once I think the awareness, the consciousness levels, however you like to describe this, I think is recognised that you will never outdo nature. When we as the species that can reason and have the power to do a lot of destructive damage actually realise that we are part of the entire construct. This is one enormous jigsaw. We are part of it, we're not separate from it, we don't live on it, we are it along with everything else. When you look in the mirror in the morning, you're looking at the most incredible piece of engineering ever constructed. You may not like it sometimes, but that's the truth. That is the truth. Every single one of us is unique. Every single one of us is individually extremely clever piece of kit. Now, the planet is where we are, and if we actually become part of it rather than trying to dominate it the whole time, I think we are actually destined for a very, very bright future. And I firmly believe we are going to grasp that, because I don't think we're that stupid. And also, as you may have noticed, he didn't call them the 10 suggestions. Thank you.
So, before we thank the panel properly, I'd like to say thank you to you for coming. If you have got to go home now, not joining us for the rest of the weekend, thank you for coming. Have a safe journey. Otherwise, we'll see some of the rest of you tomorrow morning at 9:15, bright and early. And the first speaker is me, I'm afraid. But I think you'll agree we've covered a lot of very, very interesting stuff. So please give a massive hand for our panel. Thank you very much. Thank you. You're gone.
And a big hand for our wonderful compere.